Hey guys, Frosty Knives here, back for another book review, and finally, after a long-awaited pause, we are finally going to review the final book in the Dark Tower series, Stephen King's The Dark Tower, number 7, simply entitled The Dark Tower. And first of all, I'd like to apologize to everyone for the length of time it took to getting to this final book, because life gets in the way, and well, I'm just lazy. But thank you for coming along and watching the videos and following the story along. And finally, we are here. We are at the last book in the Dark Tower series. This book was published in 2004. And this book clocks in at 830 pages. And the nice thing is at the end of this book, Stephen King also includes, as an appendix, he also includes the complete version of Chavarolam to the Dark Tower King by Robert Browning. In case anybody wanted to read it, it's nice that it's included in here. Again, this is the edition with all the photos. See if I can get to them. But this is the one with all the nice glossy photos. And so here we are. And I'd just like to say right off the bat in the beginning that since this is the final book in the story in the Tower series, there are going to be spoilers. I guess if you've been following along all this time, there have been spoilers all the way along. But we're going to talk about this and the spoilers. And if you'd rather, I guess, not get all the spoilers, you might not want to watch the video, but we've had them all along, so let's get to it. And this one is very action-packed, and a lot of stuff goes down. It's the longest book in the series, mainly because King has to tie up all of his loose ends. So, it starts where Song of Susanna left off, with Jake and Father Callahan storming the Dixie Pig, trying to get into Feddick to go after Susanna and Mia, who is about to give birth to Mordred. And the place is teeming with low men and vampires, and right off the bat, almost like 20 to 30 pages into the book, Father Callahan bites it. And he makes a stand against the vampires in order for Jake to get through and to go to Feddick and to go after Susanna. So right away, that sets the tone for the book. First character dies about 20 to 30 pages into it. And Jake does plow through with Oi, and he gets to Feddick. Meanwhile, Susanna and Mia, Mia gives birth to Mordred, finally. And Mordred is a changeling. He's a were-spider. He can shapeshift into spider form, much like the creature from It. And the first thing that baby Mordred does after he is born is turns into a spider and eats Mia. He kills Mia and eats her. And in the chaos, Susanna grabs a gun and fights the low men and the vampires that are there. She kills a bunch of them. She attempts to kill Mordred, but she misses and winds up just shooting off one of Mordred's legs. So for most of the book, all of the book actually, Mordred is a seven-legged spider. And Mordred escapes, and all of the people are dead. And then finally, Roland and Eddie are in America, and they go through through a big portal on Turtleback Lane, and they get to Feddick, and then they get to where Mia is. So eventually, the whole quartet is together again. Jake joins up with Susanna, and then Eddie and Roland joins up with Jake and Susanna, and so finally, all of them meet together in Feddick, and they decide they're going to get back on the road to the tower. And they go to Thunderclap. And they go to where the Breakers are. And the Breakers live in this big compound that they call the Devartoy, or they call it Blue Heaven, or they call it Algol Ciento. It has like 3 names. And they basically have 2 major quests. One is to stop the Breakers from breaking the beams so they can save the beams. And 2, they have to somehow get back to America to stop Stephen King from getting hit and killed by the car. So they decide to go after the breaker part of it first. And when they get to the Devartoy, when they get to Blue Heaven, I'll call it Blue Heaven because it's easier to pronounce, they meet some familiar faces. They wind up running into Ted Brautigan, who was from the book Hearts in Atlantis. They meet Dinky Earnshaw, who was from the book Everything's Eventual. And they meet Shimi Ruiz, who who Roland knew from Macius. And all three of these people are telepathic. So all of them, those three and Roland's quartet, devise a plan where they're going to storm the Blue Heaven and take down the Taheen and the vampires and free the Breakers. And that takes up a good chunk of the book. And they do. They want, it's like 4 gunslingers against 60 people. And they do wind up storming Blue Heaven, and they do wind up pretty much eradicating everybody, and they do wind up freeing the Breakers. But in the process, Eddie gets shot in the head, and Eddie dies. So here's your second death, and the first major quartet death of the book. They kind of mourn, but they don't have much time because they have to hit America side. So Shimi winds up opening a portal between the worlds, and Jake and Roland go over to America to save Stephen King, and they get to Maine hours before King's accident, like 3 or 4 hours before King's accident, and they wind up hitching a ride with a lady named Irene Tassenbaum, and she drives Roland and Jake to try to save King, and they get there just as Brian Smith, who's the one who actually hit King, is about to plow into King. And Roland tries to get out of the car and save King, but he winds up stumbling. And Jake is the one who winds up hopping out of the car. And for the second time in the series, he pushes King out of the way, and Jake gets struck and killed by Brian Smith, and he dies by being run over by a car for the second time. Boy, that kid can't catch a break, can he? Actually, he did. He broke all of his bones. So Eddie and Jake wind up dying within like 24 hours of each other. Now, of course, Roland is heartbroken, but as we all know, Roland is bad luck to his friends. So he saves King's life. I mean, King still sustains the injuries but he doesn't die. So they've now saved King, and they've now saved the Breakers and the Beams, and Irene drives Roland back to Fedek, back to the Dixie Pig, where he goes from our world to Midworld and through Fedek, and he meets up with Susanna, and they go through Thunderclap again, and now they're back on the road to the tower. And now it's just the 3 of them. Now we've got Roland, Susanna, and Oi. And they're just going on the road to the tower, and eventually they come to a little town, a little hamlet called Odds Lane. There's a little hamlet there. And they wind up running across somebody called Joe Collins. Well, Joe Collins is actually a vampire named Danville who feeds by making people laugh. He tells jokes, and he basically makes you laugh to death, and then he feeds off of your energy. And they wind up defeating Joe Collins, shooting him in the head or some such like that. And in the basement of Joe Collins' house, we find Patrick Danville from Insomnia. Remember we read Insomnia way back at the beginning? Well, here's Patrick Danville, who was locked in the cage in Joe Collins' basement. And they free him. And they find out that he has a unique talent. He's a great artist. He can draw anything with lifelike clarity within moments. And his pictures almost come to life. So he can bring things into the world by drawing them, and he can take things out of the world by erasing them. So they bring Patrick Danville along, and now it's the 4 of them on the way to the tower, and Susanna begins to realize, as she starts having dreams, that Roland needs to go on this quest alone. So she asks Patrick to draw her a door that will open up into New York City, an alternate version of New York City, where an alternate version of Eddie, an alternate version of Jake are still alive. And she asks Patrick to draw the door for her, and he does, and the door appears. And Roland doesn't want her to go, but she tells him, you have to go. You have to do this alone, and then she winds up going through the door and leaving Roland behind. She's the only member of his quartet who doesn't die, by the way. She leaves of her own volition. So now it's just Roland Patrick Danville and Oy, and they're just about to get to the tower, and Mordred has been following along the whole book, and eventually, at one night at a campsite, when Roland is trying to sleep and he puts Patrick out to watch, Mordred attacks, and Oy kind of attacks Mordred, and that gives Roland time to actually kill Mordred. Finally, he plugs him about 6 times, but in the process, Mordred winds up flinging Oy into a tree, and Oy gets impaled on a tree, and Oy dies. So Oy dies saving his din. I did forget to tell you that earlier in the book, Mordred comes across Randall Flagg, and Mordred winds up killing and eating Flagg. So Flagg is kind of disposed of pretty quickly. So now the last of his quartet is gone, and it's just Patrick and Roland, and they finally get to the tower, and the Crimson King is on the side of the tower, and he's gone crazy. He's basically locked himself on like a balcony of the tower, and he's like throwing snitches at Roland, and there's basically this standoff between the two of them. And Roland realizes that he's going to go to the tower at sunset, whether he wants to or not, because the tower is calling him. So finally what happens is Patrick draws the Crimson King, and then he uses the petals from the roses and Roland's blood to draw his eyes, and then Patrick erases him, and when he erases the picture, he erases the Crimson King from existence, and that's it. That's pretty much the final climactic battle between Roland and the Crimson King, and then Roland sends Patrick on his way, and then the book ends with Roland going to the tower and calling all the names of his dead friends, and there's a little epilogue where we see Susanna getting to alternate version of New York and meeting Eddie and meeting Jake, and it's Christmas time, and they're sort of living happily ever after in this alternate world. And that's how the book ends. Now, there is more. There's a coda at the end that actually shows Roland getting into the tower. But I'm going to leave my review the same way King leaves the book. He basically tells you after all of this is done that you can actually stop reading. He breaks the fourth wall, and he writes as himself and says, my story is done. You can stop reading. You don't actually need to know what Roland finds in the tower, so you can just close the book and walk away. So I'm going to leave this video the same way. You don't need to know what Roland finds in the tower. Just know that he does get there, and that Susanna does sort of meet with everybody else happily ever after, and we can leave it at that. If you actually do want to know what Roland finds in the tower, I'm going to make another video describing what Roland found when he actually gets into the Dark Tower. But for those of you who don't want to know, you can stop at the end of this video and know that it's as happy of an ending as you're going to get. Now, a lot of things happened. It was very action-packed. There were a couple of draggy moments, especially towards the end when Susanna and Roland are plodding along, and they've got, Patrick Danville. And there were some moments in the book that just seemed to drag, seemed like filler. There was a lot of exposition. Out of 5 stars, I will give it 4 out of 5, because there were a couple of things in the book that just made me scratch my head. One was the very anticlimactic battle between Roland and the Crimson King. Basically, having Patrick Danville erase the Crimson King out of existence, to me, felt like a cop-out, a cheap way to end, almost like King didn't know how to finish this battle, so he basically just made Patrick erase him, and that was that. It almost felt cheap, like a cop-out. Like these were supposed to be an epic battle between the last of Arthur L's descendants and the Crimson King, who's been plaguing King's books. I mean, he was in all of the Dark Tower. He was in Insomnia. He was in Black House. He's been mentioned a bunch of times. He was supposed to be the uber evil, and he gets erased. To me, that felt a little bit like a cop out. And Patrick Danville being in this book almost felt a little shoehorned in, like King said, "Oh, I remember I put him in Insomnia, but if I don't put him in this book, the readers are going to say, oh, plot hole, plot hole." So he almost felt a little shoehorned in. So I took some points off for that. I took some points off for the way Flag was disposed of. Having Mordred eat him, and that was okay, but they actually gave Flag a backstory. He had some very humble beginnings, and he has a backstory. And I'm not going to go over it. You could wiki it. I don't think he needed a backstory. I don't think he needed to be human. The fact that he was this kind of magician, semi-quasi-eternal, immortal magician was good enough for me, sort of the embodiment of evil. The fact that he got a more human backstory, I wasn't too thrilled with. And the ending, the actual ending of what Roland found in the tower, I was happy with that. I understood that, so I'm not taking any points off of that. I actually really liked the ending and really liked what Roland found in the tower. And I actually really don't mind the fact that Stephen King wrote himself into the books, because this is his Uber novel. This is his masterpiece. And so it has consumed so much of his life that it makes sense that he actually showed up in his own book as a plot device. And I was okay with that. So, how they dealt with Flag, I wasn't too thrilled with. How they dealt with the Crimson King, I wasn't too thrilled with. I liked Mordred. I liked that he was this were-spider. It kind of reminded me of it. And the book overall had a lot of great action. The first time I read it, when Eddie died, I actually cried because it was that moving. The deaths were expected because we all know that Roland is bad news to his friends. But there you have it. I'll give it a 4 out of 5. It's a semi-strong ending. King has always kind of struggled with endings in a lot of his books. So, and it kind of shows in this one. But a 4 out of 5 ending. And again, if you really want to know what's in the tower, then you can click on the next video and you can watch it. But for now, this is essentially the end. It was a pretty decent ending to a really good series, and I highly suggest everybody reads it. Even if you're not a big King fan, I would highly recommend you read the Dark Tower series, because I think there's something in it for everyone. So there we are with the end of the Dark Tower. Thanks for hanging in. Thanks for watching the videos. If you like it, subscribe, share it, pass it to your friends, pass it to your enemies, and as always, we'll see you next time.